Thank you, Charles, for slightly overwhelming remarks. There's some truth in them, perhaps. Just two things by way of a sort of an apology announcement. If I start kicking my shoes off and dancing around and trying to do an imitation of Ed Balls on Strictly, don't feel embarrassed. Just try and ignore it completely. You're welcome to laugh. I've got a pinched nerve in my spine, which is absolutely fine. But every now and again, it suddenly lands up in my foot, and there's nothing I can do about it. I just kick my feet off and dance around like this and carry on. So I'm not completely sort of zombified, but it's that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the conclusion, which is not on there. And the reason for that is that, as my colleague here started off by saying, Algeria is bad news. I think it's a very good thing for Algeria that it is suffering badly right now, because I think out of that it'll learn a lot of lessons. And I do see, and I'm an optimist in Algeria, I love the country, I've been there on and off since 3 years now. So I do have this extraordinary network in the country, and I love the country, and a lot of what's going on there for me is very sad. I do think there is a potential silver lining. So my conclusion, which I'll come on to later, but because there's so much bad news to get to that, and I don't want you to walk out halfway through, is that I think one can envisage, and it really is quite easy actually to put forward a scenario. Looking ahead, I'm not sure what time span, 3 years, 5 years, probably more like 10, where you could see the Maghreb as possibly one of the few major growth regions in the world. The potential for that region is absolutely staggering. Just one figure to bear in mind, it's a bit of a daft one. Algeria probably has greater tourist facilities or potential than almost any other country in the world. The Atlas, the coast, the sea, the desert, the rock, all this sort of stuff together. Its tourist industry is basically zilch. Their figures are nonsense on this. 35 million people a year go to Spain. That's the last figure I saw some time ago. Transfer 35 million middle-class tourists into Algeria and link it up with Morocco, and we're there. So there is, I think, huge opportunities somewhere in the future. To get there, one has to understand what's going on now. So let's come back to the slideshow here. Okay, Algeria's crisis is really two crises, one political and one economic. And the two are interrelated because of the leadership vacuum and the regime infighting, which is making economic decision-making really very, very difficult. For example, there's this whole question whether to take on external debt. Well, the government is very much divided on that. Yahya is vitally opposed to it, Salal is more in favour of it, and in between there's all these things. So nothing ever really gets decided because of these sort of internal tensions. Whether to amend the 5149 investment law, which I think has to be invested. There's talk about it right now. I think it's very much on the cards, but there's dithering, and this dithering goes on because of these sort of tensions. And a quote which some of you in the oil industry will be familiar with, in quote, "Development is so slow that it can take up to 17 years to carry a gas project from exploration to production, compared to a global average of 5 to 8 years. That's from Politico. And those of you in the... it's page up, isn't it, Charles?
Page down.
Page down. There we are. So this, on the political side, leads to these three key questions. Who will succeed Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the president? Who is actually ruling the country? And who is involved in this regime infighting that we're talking about? In terms of succession to Bouteflika, there are many names in the mix. In May, this is 3 or 4 months ago, I published a list then, a little bit thumbsuck as these things are, and I ranked them then probably Mouloud Hamrouche, followed by, I think, probably now maybe the most likely candidate, a Mr. X, a relative unknown, probably promoted out of the army, as was the case with Chadli Ben-Jadid and Zeroual. I think this is still probably the most likely, somebody we don't know about. After that, third equal, Tayyip Belaiz, Qaid Salah, I'll come on to him in a moment, the police chief, Abdelghani Khamel, his star is probably always rising marginally, getting more positive. After that, Ben Bitour, Ali Ben Flis, Salal, the Prime Minister. And I put down at the bottom there, you saw former Prime Minister Ahmed Ouyahia. This is in May. I think I'd rank him a little higher now. I'll talk about that. Former Energy Minister Sheikh Khalil, who has no chance whatsoever. There are enough criminals in the country, they don't want an even bigger one running the show. Most of those people are yesterday's men. And they're still yesterday's men, and I, if I had to put money on it, which I wouldn't, I would start looking more at number 2, because this is really the cop-out option, which does have a history to it. Since then, there's been, since May rather, there's been a lot of talk, particularly among businessmen, foreign businessmen, that have put, Ouyahia at the top of their list. The reasoning for that is really that he is the one contact area where a lot of foreign businessmen sort of meet or have access to. So there's a sort of slanted picture a bit there. And the reason for that is that if you as businessmen are going into Algeria, you're probably going through the FCE, the Businessmen's Forum. They'll look after you, take you around. So you'll be meeting that sort of crowd of people. And the FCE is very much indebted to Ouyahia for the clean hands policy of the 1990s, which was just sort of Russian oligarchs being created out of nowhere, massive corruption, the result of the IMF, get rid of state companies, a bit more privatization. Clean hands is getting rid of the good administrators in those companies, firing them, bringing in a bunch of crooks, and all the corruption that went on in the 1990s. So Ouyahia, on the one hand, is hated for having destroyed much of the economy, but many of the people now in the FCC who've made their millions are very much indebted to him for that sort of policy. So I think one has to be very careful, about what you hear about Ouyahia, depending on who you're talking to and how those people are indebted to him. But he is hugely unpopular in Algeria for a number of reasons. His reputation for corruption, which I've just talked about, the damage he inflicted on the economy in the 1990s, that whole policy area there, his role as a leading eradicator in the 1990s, his role as a suspected DRS spy against the Berbers, sort of playing both sides of the fence internally there, not trusted, his manipulation as Prime Minister of the 1997 election, when the RND party was formed to try and make that the largest party, the FLN. There's a lot of bad blood still there, and his arrogance. So a lot of downside negatives against Ouyahia. My feeling is that, he does have this support base in the FCE. Things change very, very fast. Those comments were made last May. At that time I put Ouyahia at 2%. I would now shove him up to maybe 10, 15%, and in other words, don't write him off in spite of all those negatives. Who is ruling the country? Well, really, I suppose Said Bouteflika, the president's younger brother, who is really his advisor, his gatekeeper, and more or less runs the guy. Said himself has always been thought to have presidential ambition. It's also generally assumed he has absolutely no chance whatsoever. But there are two things here. He can't really be ruled out. Nothing can be ruled out in Algeria. Extraordinary things happen all the time. And even though, on face value, Said really has no chance, he's loathed, he's hated and so forth, but he has his political machinations, he has a huge network, he runs the presidency, so don't write him off, even though I think it's highly unlikely. And I think at the moment, his negative view, if you like to call it that, is probably a little more positive right now for reasons I'll come on to than it was and has been for a long time. So maybe things are moving just slightly a bit more in Said's favour, even though that's from 1% to 2% sort of level. Ahmed Ouyahia, I've talked about. He's chief of staff. He has a lot of influence in government, obviously. He's in the presidency every day in that position. But, where does he stand in the political firmament of things? He's always been on the other side, if you like, to the presidential camp. Keep your enemies close, so he's right inside it now, that sort of syndrome. Again, as the DRS has been, ruled out in a sense, he was linked to that. You might see his star waning a bit on that front, but he's a very smart man, very fleet of foot, and one can see him getting rid of that problem and coming closer into the presidency there. So Ahmed Ouyahia is always the dark horse, I think, in this area. Much more interesting right now, of course, is the position of General Ahmed Qaid Saleh, the Chief of the Army Staff, Deputy Defence Minister. And it's been assumed, quite rightly for a long time, there's a sort of an alliance between Bouteflika and Qaid Saleh. I use Bouteflika for the presidency, that's both brothers together. Particularly since the emasculation of the DRS in 2013. So with that emasculation, which I'll come on to, you could really see Qaid Saleh, the army, and the presidency, sort of in bed together there. That's changing. Having said that, many people at the moment, or at least up until the last couple of weeks, might well have seen Qaid Saleh as the front runner. We'll come on to that in a moment. He has known presidential ambitions. He's always sort of given the impression that he's there. Those ambitions, in his mind at least, not in many others, have recently been made stronger by two facts. One is that in Tunisia you've got Beji Caid Essebsi, elected in 2004 as president. Well, he's 90, so you can have a doddering old man of 90 as president next door. What's wrong with a youngster like me, Qaid Saleh? I'm only officially 76, he's probably about 80, his age is highly contested. So Essebsi has set the example of even more old men, or more elder men, whatever the right expression is, as being capable of being presidents. And the other second thing sort of going in his favour, or at least in his eyes, he rather models himself, most people suspect, on El-Sisi in Egypt. Here is head of the army. He came to power in sort of wiping out his attacks on the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth. So he sees these two role models, saying, well, why not me as well? I'm in the same mould. So I think that's the thinking behind Qaid Saleh, at least up until the last few weeks. Right now, things if you ask me a question, I'll have to say I don't know. There is tension between Qaid Saleh and Said Bouteflika. I'll come on to this in a moment. And I think this could be absolutely critical. We'll probably know the answer within the next few weeks, but right now it's the latest, thing. There's always a new thing in Algeria. Somebody's having a go at somebody else. But right now it's Qaid Saleh and Said Bouteflika. The history of this really goes back, is the history of Algeria. It's always the tension between the various clans. The word clan in Algeria really means nothing more than political grouping. It usually has a regional base, some family links and so on and so forth. And it's generally always been between the intelligence services, the MALG, then the SM, Security Militaire, then name change to the DRS up until now, and the presidency. That cleavage, that tension, it goes right back to the Soumam Conference, in other words, the whole nature of what the Algerian state should be. So, these arguments run deep, they run rife, they come up into the newspapers every other day. Like 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was all about the Soumam Conference again. So the army versus a civilian state, this sort of conflict within the whole nature of what Algeria is. You see this tension, particularly between Medien Tufik, the head of the DRS up until a couple of years ago, who ran it for 25 years. He had this fight. This fight came right to the fore in the 1990s against President Zeroual. Much of the political upheaval in that period can be explained in that tension. And again, we have the tension between Bouteflika this time and Medien, really between 2009 and 2013. The reasons for that, just to refresh your minds on them, really, probably started when Said Bouteflika in 2009 started sort of literally jabbering on about a dynasty and he would succeed his brother. I mean, this was just hearsay and chit-chat. But in talking in those terms, he raised the issue of bringing back, as his security advisor, a man called Mohamed Bechin. And Bechin had been head of the intelligence services in the 1980s. He had been Medien's boss. Medien had got him removed in the usual way of massive public embarrassment, forcing him to humiliation in public. That was sort of the end of Bechin. He's still around. Anyhow, Said started saying, well, I'm going to bring back Bechin. Medien obviously saw this as a major threat to him and the DRS, and he started firing a few warning shots at the presidency at that time, going for corruption, and threatening them. He would expose corruption. He targeted first down at the lower levels, the East-West Highway, Ahmed Gul and these sort of people. That was ignored by the presidency, so he moved up a few tiers, started targeting Sheikh Khalil and Sonatrach business, which you're all familiar with now. Bouteflika countered that immediately by opening up a commission of inquiry into the assassinations of the 1990s, two in particular, both of which had been assassinated by Medien. That was Boudiaf, the president, and Fodil, the general, and so forth. So here's a public inquiry which would expose Medien for state capital crimes and so on and so forth. Quite serious. Well, when these things get really serious, as has happened 2 or 3 times, America stepped in, and the US went over there in very early 2010 and said, listen, guys, you've got to put a stop to this. This is difficult for us. It's, there. And they more or less ordered the cancellation of that program, so we never heard any more about it at that time. And the Sonatrach scandal is now part of history, still ongoing a bit, but you're familiar with it. Key thing has been the demise of the DRS since 2013. I've always been accused of overemphasizing the strength of the DRS prior to this time. I don't back down 1 inch on it as far as I'm concerned. They ran the country up to 2013, full stop. But since then, things have changed enormously. The reasons for this are that Israeli in Amenas, the terrorist attack on the Amenas plant in 2013, the army, which by this time, even though technically the DRS is a division of the army, the DRS was running the army. And the army command learnt of, did it know before? Maybe, but it learnt of the involvement of the DRS in that attack. What am I saying here? Bouteflika used, sorry. Anyhow, Bouteflika used a GS, Gaidsala, to, in a sense, detach the DRS various units, their commanders, sort of drawing them out of the DRS, putting them under the army command. So we're seeing the units within the DRS, several of them being taken away from Medien, placed under the command of Gaidsala, which is quite legitimate because he's head of the army and the DRS is part of the army or a unit of the army. Leaving the DRS increasingly is an empty shell. Its units, its fairly nasty units, being removed, put under Gaidsala's control. Also, this evidence about in Amenas really centered around General Hassan, who was head of the sort of stormtroopers, if you like, in the DRS, and they learned about his role in this. I won't go into this in detail. There's a huge report coming out in the next week or two on this, but the gist of it was that some of the terrorists were captured, and it was found that they had been armed by Hassan. There's a long history of this. It goes back a long time. So there was this evidence of the DRS being involved with the attackers, etc., etc. And Hassan was arrested in February 2014. Again, this was really embarrassing for Western powers, particularly America, and the United States stepped in again. This is February 2014, and sort of resolved it, and it was kept under wraps, and America saying, look, for God's sake, don't let this go public, it's really damaging, we know about it, but just lay off. So nothing much happened. There was sort of silence, if you like, after that. But Hassan was arrested again more than a year later, in August 2015. By this time, the weight had tipped more in terms of the president's favour against the DRS. The presidency now felt they could really go for the jugular a bit, and they arrested Hassan again last August. Well, that's a year and a month ago now. Again, the head of the American DNA, James Clapper, abandoned his post next to Obama in America, rushed over to Algiers. I think that's completely unprecedented. And their talks are absolutely secret, but the gist of them was, look, for God's sake, keep this one under the carpet. Don't let this go to court, or if you put it in court, just make sure it's in private and camera, and we don't want any of this stuff coming out. It's damaging to us, and it'll be damaging to everyone else. So again, the Americans intervened to try and sort of suppress this. They put Hassan on trial. It was a show trial, lasted a few hours, and that was the end of that. He was duly banged up, and a few other generals were dismissed, and you're familiar with these, the DRS generals at the same time. So this was really the knife now going in deep into the DRS from the presidency. And then in December 2015, Median himself was retired, dismissed. So you're getting this drawn-out weakening of the DRS, going for the jugular time and time again. America trying to keep it under wraps a bit, or at least not get it too acrimonious and getting too public. So by December 2015, last year, Median himself is dismissed, and there now is this huge question of, well, what's happened to the DRS, and it's a bit of an unknown question, or at least the elements of it. The regime right now is paranoid about Median. Will he come back? What's his strength underground? Will he try and come back with some sort of coup, etc., etc., etc.? The answer to that is I think he's getting weaker all the time. I also think basically he's a bit of a coward. A lot of these sort of bully people turn out that way. But again, more and more threats and laws have been made against him. So in the last few months, there's been a barrage of laws designed purely to get Median, mostly gagging laws that retired officers can't speak to the press and all this sort of stuff. And if they do, it's capital charges and potential treason and all this sort of stuff. Heavy-duty threats have been rushed through Parliament and into the official journal. And these have no other purpose than to gag Median or any of his supporters, such as Khaled Nazar, his former boss. These people are still around, and they're very critical of Bouteflika, and they are potentially dangerous. They just doesn't know how much support there might be out there. There's the whole story of the Tiberine monks again. I won't get into the details of that, but Algeria, suddenly Bouteflika giving evidence to France. So France now, if it wants to pull the strings, again has evidence that Median organised the massacre of the monks back in 1996, etc. So in other words, threats are piling up, on Median and his friends if they want to sort of move against the coup. I should say that his son works with Khaled Nazar's son in Switzerland, and their family businesses have come under attack from the government. So those of you who've got investments with any of Nazar's outfits, watch them carefully. All the state contracts are going to be pulled out from them. This is typical Algerian politics. Once they want to go for you, rug gets pulled out everywhere because they're all so interlinked. So the question is there any residual strength, power left in the ghost, if you like, of the DRS and Median? Well, there is paranoia in the regime that there might be. We just don't know. I think it is weakening all the time, but yes, there is a lot of sympathy to them. And Algerians will say, well, it's one crook against another, who's the most crooked? In a funny sort of way, more sympathy is probably moving towards Median in the public. At least we know what he was. He was the chief of the intelligence services. That's his job, ruthless, got to kill people, la-di-da-da. Whereas Bouteflika is just a criminal. That sort of thinking permeates much of the public sort of mind. Will it get any traction? I think it's getting weaker all the time as we move on, and there are new things developed. Also, when it comes to getting rid of DRS, the two people behind it were really Qaid Saleh and Ammar Sadani, the head of the FLN. So in a sense, both of those two, in a sense, have served their purpose, at least to the presidency. Qaid Saleh has served his purpose of getting rid of the DRS. It was, in a sense, if that's what he did do, it's been a brilliant job over 2 years to get rid of the most powerful man in the country to the present state of affairs. Sadani, likewise, played a political role in this vicious stuff. He is a problem, a bit of embarrassment to the government. So a lot of rumours right now that Sadani is going to be ousted. I think he probably will be. I think he really has served his time. So we're back, to this question of the future of Qaid Saleh. So for the last 2 years, he's been seen as increasingly powerful. The weight behind the presidency, he's got the DRS in behind all the units of it. But Said Bouteflika doesn't really want to see Qaid Saleh becoming president. That's not what he really has in mind. What does Said Bouteflika have in mind? Probably more immunity from prosecution to protect the Bouteflika clan interests. don't rock the boat. He doesn't want prosecution. There must be a million and one things he could be got for, etc., etc. So he's more concerned about manipulating a safe transition that will protect the Bouteflika family interests, rather than him being president himself, although there is that 2% there, which I sort of mentioned. But he doesn't really want Qaid Saleh taking over. So there's been talk, on and off for the last few months really, of the possibility of Qaid Saleh being ousted. Very easy to do. He's much older than his official 74, or so we believe. He doesn't have a great deal of respect in the army. I won't be rude about him personally, but you've seen pictures of him. Well, that's how they describe him. He's very, very corrupt. All the arms contracts, percentages. His son is immensely wealthy. He is not respected. He's not particularly liked, but he has this powerful position. And many explain the latest moves in the army last month or two, as of promotions and so forth, of Said Bouteflika bolstering up loyalty amongst top generals amongst the, on the presidential side. So some of the moves in the July appointments, Tlemceni in particular into Chief of Staff of the Ground Forces, Ben Ali is also in place, Hamel on the police there. So if you look at the array of top generals and commanders, you can see a strengthening of what we would assume to be support or likely support for the presidency, rather than Qaid Saleh. So if it comes to a clash within units of the army or commanders, one can see, I think, Said Bouteflika strengthening his position in the last few months against whatever possibilities Qaid Saleh may have there. The point is here there is huge uncertainty, and there is great potential around this latest little fight between Qaid Saleh and Said Bouteflika, and therefore political instability. The latest news on this is, don't ask me today, I don't know, but for the last week or so, last 2 weeks, a rumour that a lot of truth to it, by the way, that Qaid Saleh has been trying to build a power base in the Far East, in Annaba, using MPs. His son, who's very wealthy, trying to draw in businessmen in that sector. The question is, where does the FCE fit into that? I don't think it does, but it's a bit of an unknown. And trying to build a new clan, if you like. It's been called the Annaba clan at the moment. And the Annaba clan is really Qaid Saleh, whatever support he can get, a couple of local MPs, Alex Wali, his son, a few other businessmen. He's tried to draw in Ammar Sadani. Sadani's remained fairly uncommittal, probably because he's more worried about his own skin anyhow. I mean, he could be yesterday's man by tomorrow. So there's something going on here that at the moment is looking like tension at a fairly serious level between the presidency, Said, and Qaid Saleh. Said might be smart enough just to leave him out there, in the public domain now the news is out. Let him just hang him out to dry. Maybe oust him, maybe dismiss him, maybe just see how it plays out. The question is, might Qaid Saleh make a push? If so, how? Can we see this, to a sort of split within the military and fighting and coup d'etats and so on? Somehow I just don't think so. Qaid Saleh, I don't think he has the respect, I don't think he has the following. He's a big fat old man and he's corrupt, and I can't see him leading a coup, coming over the trenches with bayonets drawn. He's just not there. But it could be potentially dangerous, and there may be a lot of unknowns we just don't know about. So that's the present uncertainty. An example of this is really the Politico thesis. The Politico thesis is an American journal which just came out. Nothing new about this, most of you will be familiar with it. The essence of it is Algeria's got lots of energy. Europe is trying to get rid of dependency on Russia, so let's ship all Algerian energy, gas, into Europe. We will give Algeria lots of investment money, renewables, develop renewables sector, which is very underdeveloped. That will supply the domestic market, so oil and gas comes out to Europe. Europe puts in the money, develops the renewables for the local market, plus all the investments to diversify the economy, etc., etc., etc. All very sensible, all very fine. The problem is you can't really do anything in Algeria while there's no leadership at the top. Nothing much happens. Where Politico got into trouble is they said, or claimed to have said, that the solution really is we can't do anything until we've got rid of, or he's dead, gone, moved on, regime change, get rid of of Bouteflika. Well, that obviously irritated the Algerians. They don't like to be told really how to run their country or when to get rid of presidents, so that led to a bit of a dispute there. But the fundamental political thesis, I think, really is the future somewhere down the line. Before coming on to the economic crisis, there's one thing one really, I think, should stress, and this is the new security scenario. I think this is really important because a lot of potential investors, people in Nigeria, saying, well, security, it's all this in Amenas. I should say in Amenas was a false flag operation. There's a huge report on this coming out. It's finished. It's being published in the next month or so. It's just a question of finding a launch date. But let me explain just the reasons why I think the security situation is improving hugely. One is, on the domestic front, the army under Qaid Salah, and he's taking credit for this, has been much more active in just local cleaning up operations, and you see these week after week up in the central districts, eastern districts and so forth. And one does get the impression from this that the army is more active, it's on top of this, the numbers are dwindling, the engagements are less. So if you want to play statistics, which is a very dodgy business when it comes to security, everything looks as if it's getting a little bit better. Not perfect by a long shot, but it's contained, it's maybe dwindling a bit. Bit of a question mark on that. The external threat, I think the Algerians they've been hugely exaggerating this for obvious reasons. But if you look at the Libyan side and the Sahel side, the western borders have been hugely strengthened. They're still a little bit porous, but they have been strengthened hugely. So this sort of threat from IS or Daesh from the east, I don't think it's going to come across into Algeria. I never thought it would do. The obvious reason is that Daesh ideological support is south and east. So if it's been knocked out of Sirte, it's got to go somewhere. It's not going to go west. It's going to run into so-called Al-Qaeda country. No sympathy for it. It'll go to where its support is, south, Chad, east, and so forth. So I don't really see that as the threat that the Algerian government's claiming it to be. If you look into the Sahel, that's getting increasingly unstable, particularly in Mali, a very, very bad situation there. But there's no sign really of any spillover of that into Algeria. And even if it does spill over, you're 2,000 kilometres of desert between the border and anything serious. So, these external threats, I think, are much exaggerated, and I don't think they're as serious as they're made out to be. The key one is the restructuring of the DRS. The DRS was responsible for most of the major acts of terrorism in the country up until 2013. And with their being basically banged up in jail and under the threats under them, there has been a massive decline in terrorism since the DRS dissolution. Those who don't like my thesis and the role of the DRS in false flag operation, I'll just leave you with the empirical evidence and say, okay, let's not debate that one. But since they've been, banged up and dissolved, there's kind of been nothing going on. So, the empirical evidence supports my sort of theory. All of those factors, I think, are very positive for Algeria. That is good news. The major risks on the security side, infighting in the regime getting out of hand. It normally reaches a brink and somebody steps in, but the potential Qaid Salah, Saeed, Bouteflika sort of thing. The threat of the return of the DRS elements, I think that's weakening all the time, but can't be ruled out. The fear of social unrest is real. I think this is probably the biggest threat at the moment, particularly with the economic situation, which I'll move on to in a second. In 2011, with the Arab Spring, basically the regime was able to buy off these elements and so forth. Well, they can't do that now because there's no money to buy them off with. And there is the fear that increasing austerity, which we'll see much more about in the next few weeks for next year, could trigger unrest and a national uprising. Difficult to conceive because there's no organisation at that level. This has happened. This threat's been there for a long time, but it might. But I think again, there is caution in the regime. It's aware of this. There's caution over the way it's bringing in austerity measures. It is intensifying internal repression immensely against any form of opposition now. So there's probably a greater repression of opposition right now because of this fear internally. Those are the sort of risks. And I think if you look at the positives and the negatives there, the positives really overwhelm the negatives. Okay, the economic crisis. The apparent cause of this is as we all know, the oil price collapse after the end of 2014. But that crisis was really self-made as a result of the regime insisting on maintaining an economy, a rentier economy, and corruption, and put those two together, and that really explains everything. The oil price just sets it all in motion. The government has constantly been advised, going back as far as you can think, Chadley era, to diversify, get away from the rentier syndrome. But it's preferred the rentier economy. I'll give you reasons why in a moment. The example of what we mean by that, well, over 95% of foreign exchange comes in from hydrocarbons, roughly 30% of GDP, roughly 60% of government budget. You can't get worse than that. That's hydrocarbons. The country now is facing a depletion of its foreign exchange reserves, and it's facing huge trade and budget deficits. These are the sort of bare facts of the situation. Two questions are, how did Algeria get into this crisis? And even the bigger question, can it get out of it? Well, the crisis really caused oil dependency. You had the oil price collapse in the 1980s. It's not the first time this has happened. Go back to the 1980s, finished up with the IMF loan in 1994, basically saved the country from bankruptcy. It had an awful lot of other negative things. The conditionality of that loan was privatization of state assets. That leads us into what I've talked about, the sell-off, the redistribution of state assets in the 1990s under Yahya, the clean hand policy, really analogous to the sort of Russian oligarch syndrome, just dishing out state assets to highly corrupt elements and the destruction of that economy at that time. So massive corruption and destruction of the economy as it fell into corrupt hands amongst the elite. Many of those people now are the new tycoons, and hence their gratitude to Yahya and the links there. So when you're going to Algeria to look at investments, be careful who you're talking to, because you'll be mostly into the FCE and those sort of people, and they will see Yahya as the great saviour of the economy. He actually destroyed it, but it's neither here nor there. And one example, the lovely one I've just mentioned, I won't go through it, is the bus transport. One guy with a bus now that owns 3,500. I mean, this is fabulous stuff. I mean, this is corruption, on an Algerian massive scale. But that's in the past and so forth. The point is, about that, the government did not diversify as it was advised to do. Coming to the 2000s, oil prices start rising again. The policies under Bouteflika, some very good ones. First of all, paid off all external debt. Vitally important now. Algeria is not tied up in external debt problems. In fact, its accreditor lent the IMF quite a shrewd move to lend them $5 billion. It had set up a stabilization fund, which I think will be pretty well emptied within the next few months. It built up forex reserves. They got as high as 194 billion. They're down to officially 116 billion now. Salal says they'll never drop below 100. The World Bank says they'll go down to 60. Well, take your pick on that one. The negatives. So there's the positives. The negatives are massive endemic corruption at the highest level. And highest means president, that means the whole lot at the top. There is a sense, and always has been, a sense of entitlement pervades the entire regime. How big is the regime? Well, I know 3,000 individuals, add on wives and children, 10,000 people and so forth, basically feel they can just help themselves to the nation's wealth. And this is a sense of entitlement which has permeated Algeria since independence almost. The example was set by Bouteflika himself. When he was foreign minister, he embezzled 21 million as foreign minister. So he's in the forefront of this sort of pattern of events, but no one is really exempt from it. Evidence that Bouteflika and Khalil were even planning the Sonatrach scam even before he took over the presidency in 1999. That evidence is quite strong, but it might not stand up in a court of law, but the evidence is there. Qaid Saleh himself was over-promoted in 2004 to replace Mohamed Lamari. One reason was he was corrupt. In other words, Bouteflika would have him in his pocket, so would the DRS and so forth. Probably the best example of that era is the Khalifa Bank scandal, which you're familiar with. Almost everyone, right across the regime, all of them were into it up to their necks. The Bouteflika side, Median side, the whole lot. That was kind of the culture of the day almost. How did they operate this system? Well, basically, the easiest way to sort of plunder the economy was really through the import-export system. Algeria produces nothing, so everything is imported, apart from hydrocarbons. So the import-export license system, these were issued to members of the regime, families, generals, their wives, their kids, and so on and so forth. We're talking about thousands of licenses here. And the wealth was just skimmed off, mostly through over-invoicing, money laundering, and capital flight through this mechanism. Self-entitlement, using import-exports rather than that. So you've got this question which is raised now: what happened to the 800 billion that hydrocarbons have earned over the last Bouteflika era? Well, that's the big question. The economic logic of this strategy is very simple. If you're going to build up a domestic import substitution business, it's hard work. You've got to get factories and capital and run it and so forth, and the margins on that, those of you who run factories and operations, if you get a 10% net margin after tax, you're probably quite pleased with yourself. That's my book. I'm not a businessman, but I'd be satisfied with that. But that's much less than if you're importing, sitting on your backside, doing absolutely nothing, just creaming 30% off on false invoicing and all the rest of it. So the tendency for the regime is just to keep the import business going, because that is how the regime has plundered the economy, in very simplistic terms, rather than diversify, which is hard work, involves a lot of hard work. So the national wealth has therefore been plundered, while the economy has remained wholly dependent on hydrocarbon rents. What is the current state of the economy? Well, in a nutshell, forex reserves are down from, these aren't bad figures when you really think about it. Forex reserves down from 194 billion to roughly 106 billion, 116 billion last year. Most countries would sell their eye teeth to have 116 billion in the coffers. So, it's not all gloom and doom. Stabilisation fund is always a bit cagey, but it looks as if it's now empty, or will be in the coming budget. Trade deficit for this year looks as if it's going to be up around 20 billion plus or minus. The budget deficit, somewhere around 15% of GDP. These are bad news figures. In other words, on face value, the economy is heading towards some sort of notion of bankruptcy. Okay, what can the state do in the face of those big figures? Well, we're going to see a lot of this coming out in the next few months. It dribbles out details, they're debated and stuff. In the Loi de Finances of 2017, next year's budget, there's going to be huge austerity measures. They'll empty the stabilisation fund. There's talk about printing money. I don't quite know how they think they're going to do that with some sort of quantitative easing. That's maybe just rumours still. I think the obvious thing is to devalue the dinar, let it just rocket right down, because you're being paid in dollars for hydrocarbons, so in a sense that's neutralises out there. Inflationary, yes, but inflationary is not the end of the world in Algeria at the moment. Foreign borrowing, they've got fairly good credit, but the regime is divided on this. Seilal and Co. more in favour, Ouyahia more opposed, so there's internal bickering over that one. They'll increase the tax burden enormously. Various forms of import tax will be introduced. VAT's going to go up. Real estate's going to be taxed mostly at the commercial end, so those of you with company offices, keep an eye on that. Used car market's going to get banged. This is why I think there's been more registrations in the last couple of months than there have been in country's history. State subsidies will be cut, not a bad thing from a purely economic point of view. Many more radical measures to reduce imports. Not quite sure what you've got in mind here, because officially they're in place already, but there's still imports coming in. Ministry budgets are going to be cut, but details aren't very clear on that yet. Won't be the defence ministry, never is. More interesting is draconian new payment terms are coming in on state contracts. This may be something to keep an eye on. I'm not sure, where this stands in law at the moment, but it's certainly out there, and the buyers have been told. Basically, those with state contracts, the Ali Haddads of this world, they can be paid 2 years in arrears. You as a company take 2 years deferment, a bit tight, if this really is going to be implemented, which looks like it is. Also, there'll be a discretion to pay that money in state bonds, the new bond market. So you might, this is going to cause costs to rise enormously. Companies aren't going to sit back and take that. It'll just whack up their prices. It'll increase corruption massively. But that needs to be watched. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. That's there at the moment. And the risk of all that, of course, is social unrest. That's the bad news. And the conclusion is, I think there is good news. This is tough medicine. But the regime's had it coming to it for the last few generations, quite frankly. It's now got it. and it can't really get out of it apart from those measures there. I think it's learning a lesson. Pain teaches you a lesson or two, and I think maybe the regime is going through this now. Andy and I were saying before, and as soon as the oil price rises again, they'll say, oh, it's fine, back to normal. Don't think it's going to be like that this time. I think this has been too painful, it's gone on for too long, and I think there's too much international pressure, on Algeria. So through a combination of policies outlined above, with the forex reserves, there's still 100 billion there, I think the regime is capable, and it's got the foreign borrowing option. It can surmount this economic crisis. It sounds horrible, but compared to some other countries, it's not bad. And Algerians aren't stupid; they're clever. They will engineer their way through this crisis. It's going to be difficult, and I think they will learn these lessons from it. The diversification policy, it's now being implemented, sort of. But you're implementing it under the very worst conditions. You're introducing it with a pistol at your head. That's not the best way to do this. They should have done it years ago. But that is going to gain momentum. So, again, those of you who are looking into the market, seeing it as opportunities, this is going to gain momentum. It's still a bit unclear, but it's there. This is going to offer, I think, potentially huge opportunities for foreign investors in the whole import substitution sector. What's that? Well, the whole economy, quite frankly, outside of pumping out oil and gas. So almost everything. And I think there are whole new sectors. The renewable sector, that, I think is going to be massive, particularly with the EU pressure and the political argument. For most of the other sectoral opportunities, I think another thing too, I don't think Algeria needs cash. It doesn't want some sort of deep pocket, say, here's 100 million, go and fix this up. They want more than that. They need something much more sophisticated. They want partnerships. They want the know-how. They want licenses, okay? Pharmaceutical industry, okay, it's importing truckloads, it's trying to break it. They can manufacture the stuff, there's new plants, there's new schemes, they have the capabilities, they need the licenses, okay? They need to tie up with you. That's not hard cash you're shelling out, okay? So, this reduces the risk, I think. You're giving know-how, licenses, not necessarily hard cash. There will be some cash. But I think the nature of the help that is needed is very advantageous to businesses that understand this, have these contacts and can move on it. Technologies, licenses, access to markets and so on and so forth. Especially in these sectors, pretty well all of them, but renewables industry, I think, is massive scope here. Pharmaceuticals, agri-food business, communication sector and IT, country's so backward it's falling out of bed. Banking and financial services and embarrassment, all of these sectors, you might chuck in insurance and a few others, there is huge scope. The FCE, that's the Businessmen's Association, Ali Haddad's outfit and so on, they're aware of this. They're aware of the need to privatise, get more money in and so forth. This is positive thinking. Okay, there's corruption and all the rest of it, but that's not new. And they're putting pressure on the government, huge leverages on the government from the business sector and so forth. So in a sense, we're in the right mood frame. Sentiment is moving in the right direction. And there is pressure on the government from everywhere, internal pressures, Americans, Brits, all over the place. Talk to all the ambassadors there. One ex-ambassador in this room, I'm sure he had his two pennyworth on this one going back a few years, very politely saying you've got to get rid of the 51%. Well, actually, maybe it was before your time. But anyhow, that pressure is there. Get rid of the red tape, get rid of the, perk up the investment laws and so forth. There's also another area which I've always been very positive about, and I've always been proven wrong so far, but I've still got a few years to go. And it is regional opportunities. Inter-regional trade in the region is pretty near minimal, especially between Algeria and Morocco. The idea of the Maghreb Union has been bouncing around for years. It's always been on the cards. The main blockage has always come from Algeria. But there have been signs, small signs recently, of sort of moves towards a rapprochement. Haven't got very far, but the sentiment is a little bit there. Tentative, possibly needs it, but it'll need a new regime, like everything else, to realise it. So get rid of Bouteflika and a new regime, whatever, it would be the new flavour here, probably. But look at the Maghreb. You've got a population of almost 90 million. You've got 90 million people, fairly sophisticated people, some of them incredibly sophisticated, skilled and so forth, literally right there on Europe's doorstep. This is the whole Euro-Med policy, which has always been a bit of mumbo-jumbo, but it's there. It's a real fact. Potentially a huge I say underdeveloped market, it's totally underdeveloped because it's a rentier economy, and it's got to change that. It's also a potential manufacturing base for Europe and also for much of Africa. And a lot of companies are already looking at this, moving in, some of the French ones and one, two others, Germans are eyeing it, one, two British companies, and so on and so forth. So there is this huge potential there. I mentioned this figure of the tourism industry. There is no country in the world, I don't think, which has more scope in terms of attractiveness than Algeria. Downside's huge, of course, that it doesn't want tourists and all this, and the government and la-di-da-di-da and security, but all those are moving in a positive direction. As I said, dumped 35 million tourists from Spain into the North African coast, and you can start putting the noughts on the end. How long will that take? 5, 10 years. But it's a cultural change, a mental change, a regime change is needed for all that. Turning this around, I don't know, 10 years, 5 years, it I think will happen. I hope it will. And it's possible to envisage a region in the world that could be one of the few growth regions in the world. Your investment, I know you're all struggling where the next growth region is coming from. It's hard work trying to find any. The Maghreb could be one of them. In the meantime, the opportunities emerging are multiple. They're emerging all the time. Every week I write on this, you see new sort of stuff coming out, possibilities. They all carry risk where it doesn't carry risk. But the risks are not as high as some believe, and I've outlined some of the positives. And one of them is that the investment that is needed is not just cash. Getting rid of cash is painful. Most people don't have it. It's more than that. It's partnerships, it's technologies, it's licenses, it's know-how, it's will, goodwill, it's sentiment. And those of you who work in the commodities market know how important sentiment is over and above just the fundamentals. Against that risk, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. There is, against the risks I've outlined, potential unrest, political instability from the sort of things we've talked about. Against the downside, which I've probably laboured on, which is negative, it sounds negative and the press make it negative, there is this potential upside, and I think it's almost limitless. I mean, it really is. If you look at, a country, 97% of its foreign exports are oil. I mean, that's telling you there is a massive scope. Right now, I think we're at the bottom of the valley. We're looking at Algeria at the very worst time. May get a little bit deeper during next year, but we're down towards that level. The time frame probably depends, really, on Bouteflika's departure. There has to be some sort of regime change. You can't go on with this sort of chaotic situation at the moment. No one making decisions. Looking maybe towards some sort of the Politico model, as I call it, and the nature of the new regime which will emerge. I think there'll be continued progress on the security front. I'll be surprised if that goes backwards. And it depends on the speed at which Algeria can stabilise and then turn the economy round. And, a bit of an unknown. Okay, how do you keep abreast of all that? Basically, you can't afford to be left out. You cannot afford to say, Algeria's dead, it's finished, we're in Europe, a couple of miles across the water, we don't want to know about it. The world is not like that. It's there, it'll always be there, it's a chunk of land, it's not going to blow up, it's not going to disappear. There's always going to be 40 million people there. Europe is petrified that 10 million are going to come flooding over here if it goes belly up. So there's huge political pressure on Europe for this sort of scenario I'm talking about. How do you keep abreast of it? Well, read what we write. This is my problem as much as yours. I have to figure out every week where this is going and so forth, and who's argy-barging this week. Is it Kaitsila, Haitsala? You've got to keep abreast of this because the opportunities are there. And that's really all I have to say. And I think I'm a little bit prejudiced. I love Algeria. I've been there all my life. I have been terribly depressed by the way it's carried on over much of the last 10 years and the DRS side of things and so on and so forth. I think that's a little bit of the past now. I think they're learning a lesson. These downsides are hurting. There's no question about it. The regime is not being able to filter as much money off and capital flight. These things are becoming a little more tricky. They're learning and so forth. They need that help. They need encouragement. There are some people say awkward people to deal with. They are and they aren't. They're proud people. I think this is it. Algerians don't like being taken for fools. They're not. They fully understand everything I've said. There's nothing new about this to them. It's a question of how to turn it around, and they need that new regime or whichever it's going to be. And that's where we are. And I've overshot by 7 minutes. Sorry, Charles. And there you are. If you want the answers, ring up Charles and we'll send them to you.
Okay, just okay. My point of view is, of course, a little bit more technical and more reduced in a sense, but it's nevertheless important. I'm of concern in the arbitration team of Harper Smith Freehills. I'm based in Paris. I'm specialized in both commercial and investment arbitration, and I've been involved over the last number of years in a number of arbitration involving and pre-arbitration matters involving Algeria. We thought it was important to provide a little bit of this legal perspective, this how is going on with arbitration in Algeria, what are, a broad overview of arbitration in Algeria as it stands, and then give you some example of the main type of disputes. It's difficult to tell because most of the disputes are confidential, and just give you basic information about the current evolution of the arbitration landscape due to the economical and political situation. Just very quickly, Algeria is party to most international conventions on arbitration, basically the two most important ones being the New York Convention on the recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards, the other one being the Convention of Washington, dealing with the settlement of disputes related to investment between states and individuals. There is a law in Algeria, part of the Code of Civil and Administrative Procedure, date back 2008. One important element of that law is that state entities can compromise in the context of international contract, which obviously is important when you're a foreign company investing in Algeria to know that. As probably you are all aware, most contracts, if not all, signed between foreign investor and Algerian entities are in French and governed by French law and by Algerian law. And of course, because French and Algeria are, for historical reasons, closely related, there are a large number of general principles and specific legal provisions that are common to both France and Algeria. And as Algerian case law is very difficult to access because cases are not published, it is quite often in international arbitration that when you have gaps under Algerian law, you tend to use French law in order to supplement these gaps. Of course, arbitrator will apply Algerian law, but they will use French law as a way to help them. That's also a reason why Paris is a big place for arbitration of Algerian matters. What I have noticed in my experience, and I'm sure you will share your own experience in that respect, that there are arbitration agreements in many private law contracts, and that in general it is possible to obtain arbitration agreements with reference to big international arbitration institutions such as the ICC. And it's also possible, although it's becoming more complicated, to negotiate a good set of arbitration, meaning Paris, Switzerland, London. Although it's becoming more complicated now that because Algerian entities tend to try to obtain a seat in Algeria. That is for private law contracts. For a contract for public works, it's a little bit more complicated, and in my experience, the arbitration agreements in general contain more ambiguity, meaning that you're not really sure whether the dispute settlement provision that has been signed is really an arbitration agreement or whether it is somewhere between an arbitration agreement or a court jurisdiction. Also, contract for public works more often provide for ad hoc arbitration and a seat in Algeria, which can render things more complicated when you come to a dispute. Of course, in addition to arbitration agreement contained in contracts, one other important thing to consider are the bilateral investment agreements. If there is a dispute against the state or one of its organs and a foreign investor, you could try to refer to, if you are an investor from a national of a country which has signed a BIT with Algeria, then you could try your luck with ICSID or with an international tribunal under the BIT. Algeria is currently party to nearly 49 BITs that could provide such kind of protection. Currently, there are not many investment cases, meaning cases before ICSID against Algeria. There is only one pending cases at ICSID. It's published statistic. That's the reason why I'm able to tell you that, because these are published cases. And so far, there has been only 5 cases registered against Algeria. Of course, there are a number of commercial arbitration against public companies. I'm sure you are all aware about the number of arbitration that have been initiated in relation to the 2006 law on windfall tax on super profits made by foreign companies in the field of hydrocarbons. And what is interesting to see is that you've had the Anadarko Petroleum Corporation. They started an arbitration against Sonatrach, which finally settled. Then a few years later, the company Maersk started an arbitration, not against Sonatrach but against Algeria, not grounded on the contract but grounded on the Denmark-Algeria BIT. So that's really one of the two manners where you can try to obtain something if you can. And here also the parties have settled the dispute. And what is surprising is that although this law dates back 2006, there has been very recently, because it was in May 2016, Total and Repsol who started an arbitration against Sonatrach in relation to that same 2006 law. Of course, this is confidential, so I won't be able to tell you more about that. But what is interesting to me, and maybe that's something you would explain to me, and what is the reason why an arbitration has been started a few months ago in relation to a law dated back 10 years ago on the basis of the idea that this law, of course, is changing the profit-sharing terms contract. That's one, I think, number of arbitration arose out of that issue. Then I've also noticed that there are a bunch of disputes in relation to the giant construction project in Algeria that had been started by the Algerian government probably about 10 years ago or something like that, and that now about to be completed. And because these construction projects are about to be completed, of course, the contractors are now trying to obtain their money against either the Algerian state directly or against Algerian organs. I think one of the most salient arbitration that everybody's probably aware of is the Kojal arbitration in relation with the construction of the East-West motorway, which has been a big scandal for the last 3 years in Algeria, as the construction of this motorway is not completed yet. So an interesting point for this arbitration is that, and that's where I come back to the drafting of arbitration agreements, is that it relates to a public work. And that, as what we understand from what is public on that arbitration, that in 2040, the Algerian government terminated the contract concluded with the Kojal consortium, which is a consortium of Japanese companies, and based on delay in the completion of a section of this motorway. And in response, the consortium started an ICC arbitration. And the Algerian government challenged the jurisdiction of the arbitral tribunal based on the fact that the arbitration agreements did not provide for an arbitration, because it stated that the jurisdiction would be to tribunaux compétents, competent tribunals, which basically means nothing. It means court or arbitral tribunal. So when you are an arbitral tribunal facing such clause, you are in a big trouble to understand whether you have jurisdiction or not. So I don't know how this is going to end. I think there are discussions going on. There are a lot of media coverage, especially in Algeria, about that. But I think it's interesting to see that it's also a big deal of arbitration in relation to that. And the last probably big area of arbitration is in relation to the start of diversification of economy that Professor Keenan talked about a few minutes earlier, based on the project on renewable energies, because there's been a program launched in 2011, and which the goal is that 40% of the production of electricity be made out of renewable energy. This is a significant national program, and of course a number of partnerships have been started with foreign companies in order to implement that program. But has there been a collapse of photovoltaic price in 2012? Dispute arose in relation to those issues as well. What you can say from an arbitration perspective in relation to those disputes, that first, it is possible to have an arbitration between a foreign company and an Algerian entity. It is possible to settle a case, and that's one of the critiques made by the public society in Algeria against Sonatrach, for instance. And it's also possible to go to the end of an arbitration and to have real arbitration. That's something that is working. But what is going on is that because arbitration are growing and because there are much more commercial arbitration dispute over the last 10 years, and because there is more media coverage about this arbitration, of course, critics are starting. For instance, many of these critics are based on the fact that, for instance, a company like Sonatrach is only using international firms to defend itself before international tribunals, and the Algerian legal community is currently asking or recommending that for arbitration it will be also useful to have recourse to local Algerian counsel, or at least to have a team mixed between an international firm and a local counsel. Though there are huge critics, particularly against Sonatrach, who is familiar with arbitration for the last 40 or 50 years probably, because he's a frequent user of ICC arbitration. There are huge critics against Sonatrach in respect to that. And in addition to these media criticisms, I just want to mention two very recent amendments which show a trend which may complicate a little bit recourse to arbitration in the future. One is in relation with the new code for public works that came into effect in December 2015, so less than a year ago. And the new provision in relation to dispute resolution are relatively different from the ones contained in the previous code. The ones contained in the previous code were not very clear because they were dealing with competent tribunals, the one I was referring to earlier. But the difficulty now is that in case of disputes with foreign counterparties, this dispute would be subject to a newly created body, which is called in French Autorité de régulation des marchés publics et des délégations de services publics. I won't translate because what is important, and this will include another body which would be a national body for dispute resolution, which is an organe national de règlement des litiges. And honestly, there is no executive decree that has been implemented further to that new code. And so nobody at the moment is able to know what does that mean, what will happen, and how dispute in relation to public works are going to be handled in the future, because we don't know what is the national body for dispute resolution. And if anybody has any clue about that, I would be happy to hear your view. So that's quite important, and that even though that should only apply to new contract, it could be used by Algerian counterparts to require, before any arbitration, even further to ancient contract, older contract, to go through this authority before any dispute. So that's something to be careful about. In addition, in relation to the new investment law dated 2016, One of the most disputed feature of this law is the Rule 5149, which has been repealed and placed in the financial law, but I know you're probably all aware about that. But the other change, which is important, is that in relation to dispute resolution, it gives jurisdiction to the Algerian courts in the event of disputes between foreign investor and the Algerian states, except where there are bilateral or multilateral convention or an agreement, including an arbitration clause in place. So what it means, it does not mean that there is no more arbitration, because of course in contract you will always be able to have an arbitration agreement, but it means that failing such arbitration agreements, as a matter of principle, it is clear that the preference go to Algerian courts rather than arbitral tribunals. So that's probably an interpretation of the old wording of competent tribunals of before, but that's an interpretation that goes in favor of Algerian court, which render the handling of dispute more difficult probably than it was before. So I think we should be careful as to the evolution of the recourse and arbitration in the future, in view of this recent evolution and in view of the widespread critique against arbitration. So that was my presentation.